Jasmine Crockett revealed the harsh truth: cancer patients die from costs, not disease. She fought for families in debt while Josh Hawley defended the system. When she raised the bill that stole a mother's life, silence fell. Would Hawley pay, or would Jasmine's voice rise unstoppable? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The Senate Health Committee room was sealed off from the world. No cameras, no press, only transcripts and tension. The air was cold still, as if waiting for a blow that hadn't landed yet. Josh Hawley sat upright, voice smooth and confident. As he opened, high drug prices, he said, are a result of medical progress. We shouldn't criminalize innovation. A few heads nodded. The line was sharp, but practice meant to frame profit as virtue. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply reached into her folder, pulled out a single sheet of white paper, and placed it on the table in front of her. No color, no charts. Just one bold line of text centered at the top: cost to manufacture one dose of Clavamed, $17.42, price billed to Medicare, $1.215 mourners. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. The numbers did the shouting. There was no need for graphs or technical language. Two numbers were enough to change the temperature in the room. One senator leaned forward staring. Another shifted in his chair. A pen clicked nervously in the back. The silence after was not confusion. It was recognition. And Josh Hawley, who had started the morning with full command of the narrative, suddenly had no ground beneath his feet. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Those two numbers were only the beginning. The silence that followed wasn't an ending. It was a fuse. She leaned forward, not aggressively, but with the weight of someone carrying something undeniable. Her hands moved with precision, no wasted motion, no need to stir drama. Just truth measured and deliberate. Her eyes never left Hawley's, but her voice was louder than any gavel. Senator Hawley, she said, tone steady and razor clean, are you aware that Trioxin raised the price of Clavamed 9 separate times in the last 14 months? There was no inflection in her voice, no anger, only the quiet discipline of someone putting a loaded fact on the table and daring the room to look away. Hawley shifted slightly enough for anyone paying attention to see it. His spine stiffened, his lips pressed tight before responding with a voice pitched higher than before. I don't interfere with pricing decisions made by private companies, he snapped. The delivery was sharp but not confident. That's the free market at work. He gave a quick glance around the committee, expecting the phrase to land like a shield. It didn't. There were no approving nods this time, just the echo of a defense that sounded thinner than it did 10 minutes earlier. Jasmine remained composed. No smirk, no interruption. She had heard that line before. America had heard that line before. And this time she came ready to break it. She opened a new folder, thinner but more lethal, a single sheet inside. She slid it out and raised it chest high so every senator could see. No clutter, no footnotes, just a bold column of dates and dollar signs. Then explain this, she said, and her tone didn't rise, it deepened. She turned the paper so the chairman could see first, then slowly laid it flat on the table between her and Hawley. The numbers were impossible to miss. She raised the sheet with quiet finality and began to read aloud, not for drama, but for clarity. On May 3rd, the price of Clavamed was $83 per dose, she said. By June 12th, it jumped to $170. On September 8th, it more than doubled again to $420. Then on November 15th, it spiked to nearly $800. And by February the 2nd, she paused, looking directly at Hawley. The price hit $1,200. Her tone remained calm, but the pattern was devastating. There was no way to explain away that climb, not as coincidence, not as innovation. It was arithmetic with a motive, and more 9 entries in all. Each one stamped with a date, each one showing a price spike that leapt like a heartbeat under distress. But it wasn't just the numbers. Jasmine leaned in closer, tapped the table once with the cap of her pen. Every one of those hikes, she said, pausing between each word as if weighing them out for clarity, came within 10 days of a policy memo from the Drug Pricing Advisory Council. And who co-chairs that council? Senator, the question wasn't rhetorical. It was surgical, a slice through pretense. The room didn't stir. No one had to. The implication didn't need to be said aloud. It was already printed, dated, and placed in front of them. Hawley's face tightened. His jaw moved, but no sound followed. For a moment, the man who opened this hearing, declaring innovation above regulation, was now face to face with innovation's invoice, signed, dated, and padded. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't even breathe heavily. She simply looked at him as if waiting not for an answer, but for accountability. And in that moment, Hawley wasn't a senator. He was just another man sitting in front of a truth too sharp to spin. The numbers had done their damage, but Jasmine wasn't done. The air in the committee room had turned brittle, every breath tighter than the last. Truth had already shaken the floor, but now she moved in for the strike no senator wanted on the record. Calmly, without theatrics, she reached back into her binder and pulled out a single-page document, color, printed, uncreased, deliberate. She laid it on the table like a final card in a rigged game and slid it forward until it rested between her and the chairman. "Here's a thank you letter," she said, her voice low and unwavering. "From Trioxin to your Drug Pricing Advisory Council." Her fingers didn't tremble, her tone didn't change. But what she placed on that polished wood sent a different kind of tremor through the room. At the top of the letter was Trioxin's logo, crisp and unmistakable. In the center, a sentence highlighted in soft yellow ink, but it may as well have been fire. "We thank Senator Hawley for supporting a favorable policy environment. Our Q3 pricing adjustments will reflect this alignment." It wasn't vague, it wasn't speculation. It was gratitude, calculated, corporate, and chilling. The letter didn't accuse, it confirmed. Not just that Trioxin raised the price of Clavamed, but that they considered Hawley part of the reason why they could. For a breathless moment, no one moved. Then came the explosion. "I don't run Trioxin," Hawley barked, slamming his palm onto the table hard enough to rattle pens. "And I'm not responsible for their thank you notes." His voice echoed off the marble like a desperate defense trying to wear the mask of authority. His face flushed with visible anger, not the kind that comes from injustice, but from exposure. He scanned the room for support, but no one reached for a lifeline. They just watched. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't need volume. She had precision. Her voice cooled the room like steel pulled from ice. "But you received it," she said, "and you continued to chair the proposals tied directly to that drug." The line landed with surgical exactness. It wasn't speculation. It was timeline. Fact. Connection. Cause and consequence. The silence that followed was total, the kind that doesn't beg for answers, it announces them. Hawley's anger had burned too fast. Now all that remained was smoke and the unmistakable look of a man who realized too late that this wasn't a debate, it was an audit, and the receipts had just been read into the record. The silence Hawley left behind wasn't just awkward, it was hollow, echoing with something deeper than politics. Jasmine let it sit for a moment, long enough for the weight of what had just been said to settle into every corner of the room. Then, with the same quiet control that had guided every move since the hearing began, she turned to the final witness seated behind her. "Dr. Alan Reyes," she said, nodding respectfully. The man rose slowly, holding a single-page printout, his white coat wrinkled at the cuff's, eyes dark with fatigue. He wasn't a lobbyist. He wasn't a policymaker. He was what happened after the votes were cast and the memos were signed. He cleared his throat and unfolded the page with both hands. "Over the past 8 months, he began, voice flat but firm. 17 of my patients' Medicare recipients were forced to stop treatment with Clavamed. Their insurance providers denied payment once the new pricing was implemented." He paused. "These weren't hypothetical cases. These were names. People I saw every week. People who asked me what went wrong when they got their denial letters." He looked up briefly, his eyes scanning the panel, not accusing, but exhausted. Jasmine sat quietly, hands folded, but the room could feel her listening with a precision sharper than any objection. Then she asked gently, but without hesitation, "Of those 17, how many are still alive today?" It wasn't a rhetorical question. It wasn't a trap. It was a request for truth, unvarnished, irreversible truth. Dr. Reyes swallowed once and looked down. A few seconds passed. His voice cracked slightly as he answered. "Only 4. The number didn't explode. It fell. Hard. He didn't need to say anything else. The absence of those 13 names said more than any policy paper ever could." Jasmine turned her head slowly back toward Hawley. She didn't raise her eyebrows, didn't lean forward, didn't add emphasis. She just asked, her tone cold and level, "Is this the result of the so-called reasonable price adjustments You proposed. The silence that followed was no longer procedural. It was moral. And this time, even Hawley didn't try to speak, because anything he said now would have to stand next to 13 people who couldn't. Absolutely. Below is the rewritten section with deeper detail, sharper tension, and exactly 700 words fully in line with your instructions, and focus solely on the part you requested, no drift into the next segment. The silence after Jasmine's final question to Hawley still hadn't broken. No one dared shift in their seats. No one breathed too loudly. That question, is this the result of the so-called reasonable price adjustments you proposed, still hovered like smoke, and in it 13 ghosts. Jasmine allowed that silence to do its work, gave it space to settle and sting. But when she spoke again, her voice was not a return to debate. It was an escalation. Smooth, deliberate, without a trace of performance, she lifted another document from her folder and slid it onto the table. This, she said, her tone steady as a consulting contract between Trioxin Pharmaceuticals and the Missouri Center for Pharmaceutical Market Research. She tapped the front page. Annual value $35,000. It was clean, official, and marked by the unmistakable seals of 2 institutions. There were no redactions, no missing pages, every line visible, every dollar accounted for. She let the number linger just long enough before delivering the detail that turned heads. The mailing address of this research center, she continued, is identical to the private law office of Mr. Samuel Breck, longtime personal friend and former legal advisor to Senator Hawley. A hush swept across the chamber like wind through dry grass. Jasmine didn't smile, didn't raise her eyebrow. She didn't need to. Her weapon was never volume. It was precision. And under scope of work, she said, flipping to the second page, the contract lists 3 specific functions: policy consulting, hearing response drafting, and support data provision for the co-chair of the committee. She looked up. That co-chair, for the record, is you, Senator Hawley. There it was, not just correlation, but causation. Not just friendship, but funding. Not just a company, but a paper trail. It wasn't speculative, it was contractual. And the room suddenly felt smaller. Hawley's fist came down with a sharp slap on the lacquered wood. "I don't run that office," he roared. His voice cracked through the room like a whip, defensive, outrage cornered. The power in his voice had changed. Earlier, it had been confidence masked as authority. Now it was panic disguised as indignation. "I don't run that office," he repeated louder, as if repetition could scrub ink from paper, as if shouting could rewrite what had already been signed. Jasmine stayed still. No retort. No rush. Just silence. A silence that felt colder than any argument. Then, with a motion as smooth as before, she pulled one final item from her folder, a photograph. Color print. Clear resolution. She held it up slowly so the panel could see it. At the top of the page was the Senate's letterhead. In the middle, a handwritten note, in dark ink, unmistakable cursive. She didn't need to narrate it, but she did anyway, each word placed like a stone on Hawley's chest. "Thank you all for helping clarify the strategic necessity of the proposed price adjustment policy." Her tone never shifted. She didn't speak in accusation, only exposure. And that was worse. The signature at the bottom, bold, sure, official, read Josh Hawley. He didn't slam the table again. He didn't speak at all. The anger was still there, but now it was tangled in something else. Confusion, fear, realization. The committee room wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a courtroom without a gavel. And Jasmine had just entered Exhibit E. Hawley's eyes darted to the letter, then the contract, then the photo. Then to nothing. He didn't meet anyone's gaze. The words he wanted, outrage, denial, dismissal, evaporated before reaching his lips. All he had left was the sound of his own breathing. Uneven. Audible. The man who had opened the hearing with sweeping generalizations and polished rebuttals was now gripping the edge of the table with white knuckles. Not because he had lost a debate, but because he had lost the narrative. Jasmine hadn't embarrassed him with theatrics. She had buried him in receipts. And somewhere beneath that rising tide of documents and facts, the unmistakable shift occurred, not just in the room, but in him. His fury was no longer aimed at Jasmine. It was turned inward, battling the realization that he hadn't been out-argued. He'd been unmasked. The room was already shifting. Jasmine had laid down fact after fact, each one cutting deeper. And now the balance of power was clearly tilting. But she wasn't done. Not yet. She moved calmly without rushing and pulled out one last document, this one thin, just a printed email on white paper. No thick folders, no color charts. But the look in her eyes said it carried more weight than anything she'd shown so far. She placed it on the table. Her voice stayed calm and clear. This, she said, is an internal email from Trioxin, dated 13 months ago. She let the room settle before continuing. It was drafted using a computer inside the Senate network. She looked directly at Hawley. That IP address belongs to your office. That landed hard. People didn't need time to think, they just froze. No one spoke, no one coughed. Even the air felt like it had stopped moving. Jasmine looked down at the email again. Then she read the message out loud, word for word. The committee has signed off on the Clavamed pricing roadmap. We just need to avoid the adjustment during the election cycle. 10 simple words, but they said it all. A plan to raise the price of cancer medications signed off by a government committee, and the only concern, don't do it too close to the election. Not because of ethics, not because of patience, but because it might look bad politically. That sentence didn't need explanation. It was pure strategy, cold, calculated, and brutal. Hawley couldn't stay quiet. He slammed his hand on the table. That's fabricated, he shouted louder than ever. There's no independent verification. That document has no chain of custody. His face was red. His voice cracked. He wasn't making a point anymore. He was trying to keep control of the room, but it was slipping away fast. Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't look surprised. She just calmly slid one more sheet across the table. It was a digital verification certificate, plain white paper with a small blue logo and technical language across the top. This is a cryptographic certificate from InfoCert Group, she said. It's been digitally validated and time-stamped 13 months ago. That means this file hasn't been changed, edited, or tampered with in any way. She looked up again. Not even once. This time no one shouted, no one moved, but the mood in the room shifted. You could feel it. A chair creaked as someone leaned back. Another person quietly stopped taking notes and set their pen down. No one gasped. No one needed to. The silence said more than words ever could. Hawley's eyes went from the email to the certificate, then back to Jasmine. His jaw tensed. He opened his mouth like he wanted to respond, but nothing came out. There was nothing left to say. He wasn't looking at his staff anymore. He wasn't looking at the chairman. He just stared at the table, at the documents he couldn't erase. And in that moment, it was clear. The shouting hadn't saved him. The talking points weren't enough, because the evidence didn't need to scream, it just needed to exist. And Jasmine had made sure it did. She sat there without raising her voice, without insulting him, without grandstanding. But everything in the room had changed. The control he thought he had gone. The doubts others had tried to ignore. Now undeniable, the most powerful voice wasn't the loudest one. It was the quiet one that told the truth and had the proof to back it up. By now, the walls of the hearing room felt tighter, like the air itself had turned heavy with everything that had been said and, more importantly, everything that could no longer be denied. The room wasn't debating anymore. It was listening, breathing slower, reacting not with questions but with silence. Jasmine knew that this was the final moment, the one that would either turn hearts or turn away, and she came prepared for it. She didn't reach for another exhibit. She didn't gesture toward a screen. Instead, she unfolded a single piece of paper from a worn beige folder. No logos, no headers. It wasn't a briefing memo or a chart. It was something far more intimate, a hospital invoice. She held it lightly in her hands as if it carried more weight than its page suggested, and it did. This is from St. Luke's Oncology, she said calmly. From a patient named Carla Watkins. There was no tremble in her voice. But the silence she carried into that line told everyone in the room this wasn't political. This was personal. Jasmine placed the invoice gently on the table, just inches from the microphone. The page was already creased from folding a slight smear on the corner from where someone had held it too tightly. She leaned in and began to read, her voice low but cutting. Clavamd, 5 doses, total $6, $205, Medicare not covered. Note exceeds reimbursement cap. There was no outrage in her tone, only clarity. The number alone did the shouting, and then without pause she continued. At the bottom of the invoice, the patient left a handwritten note. She didn't embellish. She didn't editorialize, she just said it word for word. I don't blame anyone. I just want to live long enough to see my son start first grade. The hearing room, already quiet, now felt sacred, like a place where something irreversible had just occurred. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't dramatize. She just folded the paper back up, deliberate, slow, careful, almost like she was tucking away a piece of someone's life. Then she looked up at Josh Hawley, not with anger, not with pride, but with a gaze so steady it became a mirror. Senator Prices don't kill people, but your policies are doing it on their behalf. The room didn't gasp. It didn't shift. It simply stopped, as if the weight of that line pinned every soul to their seat. And across the table, Hawley, who had barked, rebutted, slammed, suddenly did none of those things. He stared down. The same hands that had once slammed the desk now sat motionless. There was no twitch in his mouth, no furrow in his brow. He just stopped. He bowed his head not as an admission of guilt, but because there was nothing left to defend. Not against a spreadsheet, not against an invoice, not against a mother who only wanted to see her child walk into a classroom and was denied that not by illness, but by policy. No sound came after, no commentary, no motion, just one truth left hanging in the air unchallenged. And for the first time that day, it felt like the room itself was grieving. The silence that followed Jasmine's final words wasn't just uncomfortable, it was historical. No one moved, not even Hawley, who now sat with a stiffness that betrayed everything he tried to project. Around him, the room wasn't just quiet, it was still, like the very oxygen had changed. The emotional current Jasmine had unleashed refused to dissipate. It lingered like smoke after an explosion, no longer loud, but impossible to ignore. Then the chair leaned forward, pressing his palm against the wooden desk, and breaking the silence with something that sounded less like a command and more like a quiet truce. We'll recess for 15 minutes. The words landed not with relief but with exhaustion. No gavel struck. No sigh of protocol. Just an invisible wave moving across the room as senators began to stand not all at once, but in scattered, hesitant motion. Their faces were flat, drained of performance. For once, no one looked for the camera, because there weren't any, and somehow that made the weight of what had just happened feel heavier. Across the aisle, the Republican senators, usually quick to huddle, whisper or shield each other with shared indignation, moved like strangers. One or two glanced toward Hawley, then quickly looked away. Not one person stopped to speak with him, not a single nod of solidarity. His usual allies didn't even slow down as they filed out. It was as if he had become a shadow no one wanted to touch. Josh Hawley remained seated. His jaw was locked, fists curled just beneath the surface of the table. His papers lay unorganized, his water untouched. He wasn't reviewing arguments or preparing rebuttals. He wasn't defending himself anymore. He was waiting for what even he didn't seem to know. The confidence that had carried him into this room like armor now looked brittle, hollow. It wasn't just that he'd been outmaneuvered. It was that the truth no longer needed to shout, it had settled into the room like gravity. Near the back of the chamber, a young clerk, one of the quiet ones who rarely spoke, except when called, collected a few scattered documents from a side table. As he reached for a pen someone had left behind, he let out a quiet sigh and muttered without thinking, "The paperwork this year won't look like last year." It was barely audible, but in a room this tense, it rang out like poetry. There was no mockery in his tone, no bitterness, only recognition that the committee's record had changed not just in content, but in conscience. Jasmine didn't move quickly, but she moved with purpose. No show of celebration, no smirk of victory. Her hands moved in rhythm, folding exhibits, closing binders, aligning tabs. Her workspace had been a battlefield an hour ago. Now it was becoming orderly again, but not because the fight was over, because the war had entered a new phase. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her phone. No facial recognition, no fingerprint scan. She typed manually, deliberately. The screen lit up with a short message. No emojis, no preamble, just a command to someone on the other end already waiting. Start preparing the special counsel request. Then with a tap, she sent it. Not out of revenge, not even out of celebration. She sent it like someone who had spent too many nights knowing how this story would play out if no one stood up. In that moment, Jasmine wasn't just a congresswoman, she was the keeper of consequence. And what she had just unleashed wasn't noise, wasn't spectacle, it was the beginning of accountability. 15 minutes wouldn't be enough to absorb what had happened, but it would be enough to ensure that when the committee reconvened, the balance of the room would never be the same. As the door to the committee room creaked open and the members slowly trickled out during the recess, the silence was deceptive. On the surface, it was just 15 minutes. But underneath, something irreversible had been set in motion. The air in the corridors wasn't buzzing, it was thick, dense. Unspoken tension hung between every aide, every clerk, every senator who passed each other without words. No one looked directly at Hawley, not even his own staffers. Jasmine hadn't screamed. She hadn't needed to. The documents had done the screaming for her, and the echo was already traveling far beyond the marble walls. Within 2 hours of adjournment, the first tremor surfaced not on national news or trending hashtags, but in a chain email sent quietly between medical administrators in New Jersey and Ohio. Attached was a document marked Confidential, Internal Estimate. It had come from deep inside Trioxin's logistics department. No watermark, no flashy graphics, just cold black and white numbers. Unit production cost per Clavamed dose, 17 non-42s. Below it in smaller font, one line struck like a match to dry leaves, price increase legally supported through policy adjustment per committee recommendations. That sentence tore through the professional community like an indictment with no trial. It was clear, specific, and referenced the very committee Hawley co-chaired. The one Jasmine had held up to the light just hours before. The leak didn't go to CNN or MSNBC. It went to oncology units, to hospital purchasing directors, to nonprofit administrators who'd spent the last 2 years begging pharmaceutical reps for discounts on cancer meds. It was passed around quietly like sacred truth in a world of noise. One administrator forwarded it with the subject line, "So it wasn't us losing bargaining power, it was rigged." By nightfall, more began to follow. Screenshots of hospital invoices began trickling into private forums, Medicare boards, cancer support, Slack groups, even a few Reddit threads run by clinical pharmacists. All shared the same anatomy. Clavamd, 5 doses, 6,205 billed. Medicare reimbursement, $0. Denial code exceeds policy price threshold. Some invoices had red circles around the totals. Others had scribbled notes in the margins. Patient refused second round. Too expensive. Family opted for palliative care. Request for appeal denied. But the most haunting one came from a nurse in Pittsburgh who posted the note anonymously with the caption, "This is not healthcare. This is a lottery." As the documents piled up, a quiet rage began forming, not the kind seen in protests, but the kind that settles deep in the bones of professionals sworn to do no harm. These weren't political activists. They were the gatekeepers of the system, and they were starting to realize they'd been used. Across the country in boardrooms and break rooms, physicians whispered to each other, "Did you see that memo?" Clinical pharmacists started pulling older order logs, comparing them with new price lists, and each comparison only proved what Jasmine had laid bare. The prices didn't rise with innovation. They rose with legislation, tailored, timed, and rubber-stamped by people who were supposed to protect the public. The corporate defense that always echoed, "It's the cost of innovation," was now brittle, hollow, because this time the proof was too specific to ignore. No speculative journalism, no hyperbolic testimony, just manufacturing cost committee timestamps and internal memos with names, signatures, and IP addresses. Then came the voices. A retired pharmacist from Florida posted, "We were told Clavamed was a breakthrough. What they didn't say was the breakthrough happened in pricing strategy, not in medicine." A Medicare billing specialist wrote, "I've had to explain to 6 families this week why we can't cover their chemo. Now I know why, and I'm sick." And one doctor, writing under a pseudonym, said this wasn't a free market. It was a trap disguised as treatment. Slowly but surely, the story shifted. It was no longer about a company pushing the envelope. It was about public infrastructure, government policy, taxpayer-backed insurance being weaponized to serve private profits. It was about Clavamed not as a drug, but as a financial instrument. And the moment that realization landed, The debate changed from one of ethics to one of accountability. Health policy experts began to speak up, not with outrage, but with precision. The New England Journal of Medicine published a midnight editorial. This was not market drift. This was engineered profit underwritten by state power. And when that sentence landed in inboxes across Washington, suddenly no one was asking whether Jasmine had exaggerated. They were asking how long this had been going on and who else was in on it. Back in the Capitol, even staffers unaffiliated with the committee were printing out copies of the Clavum memo. One junior aide from an opposing party was overheard saying, "I don't care what side you're on. That woman just ripped the mask off." In under 24 hours, Jasmine's evidence had done something few thought possible. It bypassed the circus of public relations and went straight to the arteries of the system itself. Not through outrage, not through performative drama, through quiet, relentless documentation, through names, dates, and costs, through handwritten notes on hospital bills, through the simple math that $17 did not become $1 or $2.50 by accident. The silence in the press remained, but the noise inside the institutions had begun, and it was louder than anything cable news could manufacture. And somewhere between the conference calls, the Slack messages, and the frantic internal reviews, a new sentence started appearing on sticky notes, on whiteboards, and whispered conversations behind closed doors. Start drafting a new price ceiling recommendation, not because of politics, but because the system had seen its reflection and it could no longer pretend not to recognize the face staring back. The momentum outside Capitol Hill had shifted like a storm front. What began as a tense hearing in a closed Senate room was now bleeding into the arteries of federal oversight. Jasmine Crockett had not simply embarrassed a senator, she had introduced evidence so precise, so unflinchingly direct, that the machinery of government could no longer look away. Accountability was no longer a concept, it had been triggered. In the days following the session, the Government Accountability Office, familiarly known as the GAO, released a formal notice. It was brief, just a paragraph, but every word carried the weight of statute. An official investigation has been initiated regarding potential conflicts of interest in the advisement of pharmaceutical pricing policy, particularly surrounding the formulation and authorization of Medicare drug costs related to Clavamed. There were no accusations yet, but there were subpoenas. There was now a legal line drawn on the marble floor between what had been said in defense of innovation and what was being uncovered as facilitation of exploitation. The GAO's announcement sent a ripple through the halls of the Capitol, but it was the Senate Ethics Committee's swift response that turned ripples into waves. With a unanimous internal vote, they issued a directive. Senator Josh Hawley was formally compelled to surrender all materials associated with the so-called Pharmaceutical Policy Research Committee. Every memo, every communication, every funding contract, and crucially, every piece of correspondence with Trioxin or its surrogates. The weight of that directive could not be overstated. It meant his colleagues, his own party, were no longer willing to defend him blindly. What had once been political theater was now legal exposure. What had been a debate was now a paper trail. Inside Hawley's office, the atmosphere turned arctic. Staffers stopped talking near open doors. The phones, once buzzing with media opportunities and policy consultations, now rang less frequently and were answered even less. No press releases, no defiant statements, no tweets. For a man known for commanding attention, his silence was louder than any speech he'd ever made. The next moment came like an aftershock, but this time from the private sector. A man named Martin Delaney, a mid-level director of regulatory compliance at Trioxin, stepped forward. He wasn't subpoenaed. He wasn't named in any formal request. He appeared voluntarily at the GAO's investigative office, requesting to submit testimony under oath. His entrance wasn't dramatic, but the consequences were seismic. He wore no suit jacket, no entourage, just a worn leather briefcase and a flat voice that didn't crack once. What he said in that quiet room changed everything. The Senate didn't write policy for us, but they created the corridor so we could write it for ourselves. That single sentence cut through the fog like a spotlight, because it didn't accuse anyone of criminal acts. It didn't claim bribes or backdoor payments. What it revealed was permission, an engineered vacuum where a powerful company was allowed to design rules under the illusion of regulation. The structure wasn't illegal. That was what made it dangerous. It was legal, but only because those in power designed it that way. The internal records that Jasmine had laid out, email, metadata committee, thank you notes, policy recommendations, timed perfectly with price hikes, suddenly became more than suspicious coincidences. They were now evidence in an active inquiry. Journalists from health policy journals normally buried deep in subscription-only content began publishing open-access breakdowns of Trioxin's model. Industry experts explained in plain language how Medicare price caps could be lifted not through scientific breakthrough but through strategic policy influence, a term that sounded clinical but was in truth a velvet glove for legalized profiteering. And Josh Hawley. He vanished. No Sunday show appearances, no Senate hallway quips, no rallies. He withdrew from a scheduled keynote at a biotech conference. His team issued a single statement saying he would be focused on ongoing committee responsibilities. But insiders knew better. He was being told to lie low. Every move he made from this point forward could become exhibit material. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett did not hold a press conference. She didn't take a victory lap. She simply returned to her office, opened her laptop, and began building her next file. Because for her, this wasn't about a political rival falling. This was about restoring the principle that policy must serve the public, not those who profit from disease. In that sense, the real power of the moment wasn't in Hawley's silence. It was in the echo that silence left behind, an unspoken admission that somewhere behind the legislative jargon and the corporate pledges of saving lives, a line had been crossed. And for the first time, it was being dragged back into the light. The investigation was moving, quietly, relentlessly. But something else, something deeper was unfolding behind closed doors, beneath the roar of headlines and beneath the political stage. The moment Jasmine had exposed the chain of policy manipulations was not just a scandal. It was a mirror, and America had begun to look into it. 10 days after the hearing, Jasmine Crockett's office had to redirect all mail intake to an auxiliary archive room in the basement. Not because of press requests, not because of donors, because of letters, handwritten letters. Over 7,000 envelopes arrived from every corner of the country, many in crumpled paper, some with coffee stains, others written in trembling cursive. They came from retired nurses, county doctors, cancer survivors, Medicare patients, and grieving families. There was no filter, no PR campaign, just raw humanity being poured into envelopes and addressed to a woman who had spoken the truth inside a room where truth rarely survived. One letter came on yellow legal paper, no return address. The handwriting was steady clinical, signed with an MD. I prescribed Clavamed to 3 patients this past year. All 3 had to take out loans. All 3 are still paying. Thank you for speaking for them in a room they could never walk into. Jasmine read that one twice, then pinned it silently above her desk. Another envelope came from a woman in Nebraska. No politics, no anger, just pain, and something close to grace. Enclosed was a copy of a hospital bill dated 6 months ago. Highlighted in red ink was the line item Clavamed chemotherapy, $6,205. Medicare declined coverage. Attached to the bill was a brief handwritten note: I couldn't save my son, but I hope my son helps save someone else through this truth. Jasmine didn't speak when she read it. She just placed her hand gently on the page and sat in silence. And still the letters came. One from a retired pharmacist in upstate New York who said she left the profession because it started to feel more like a bank than a clinic. One from a Vietnam veteran who had to choose between refilling his heart medication and his wife's cancer drugs. Tell them I already made my sacrifice. One from a small-town pastor who enclosed 3 funeral programs, all gone before 60. All had insurance. All still couldn't afford to live. Jasmine didn't post the letters online. She didn't weaponize them in front of cameras. She didn't announce a task force or hold a grandstanding press conference. Instead, she made one quiet move. She sent encrypted invites to a closed-room dialogue. No cameras, no microphones, no political theater. The room was plain. No seal of Congress, no ceremonial flags. Just a long wooden table, 3 carafes of water, and a legal pad at each seat. Jasmine sat at the head, not as a senator, but as a listener. Across from her sat 3 people: a senior policy director from Medicare, a lead auditor from GRO, and a deputy from the Department of Health and Human Services. All 3 had received summaries of the hearing, the digital forensics, the pricing cascade timeline. But Jasmine didn't lead with documents. She began with the letter from the mother. She passed it across the table without saying a word. They read it in silence. Only after a minute did she finally speak, voice low but unshaking. We keep talking about price ceilings, reimbursements, cost efficiency, but we've left out one word from every conversation: grief. She slid the next document forward, the yellow legal paper from the anonymous doctor. This system doesn't need an overhaul. It needs a conscience. For an hour, no one raised their voices. No one interrupted. There were no PowerPoints, no jargon. Jasmine wasn't there to debate. She was there to demand clarity, not in policy, but in intent. When the GAO auditor asked whether she intended to file for a formal regulatory amendment, she answered without blinking, "Not yet. First, I want to know if you're prepared to do what the law already allows." When the Medicare official mentioned risk assessment, Jasmine cut in, not angrily but precisely. People are not risk models. You don't put a mother's last month of life in a spreadsheet. The conversation wasn't soft, it was surgical. Every question Jasmine posed was tethered to a real name, a real date, a real bill. She wasn't quoting ideology, she was quoting invoices. By the end of the session, no commitments were made, no joint statements released, but something changed in the room. You could feel it in the way the GAO auditor flipped his pen in thought. You could see it in the Medicare deputy's eyes when she tucked the mother's letter into her briefcase, as if it needed to be carried personally. Outside the building, no reporters waited. No hashtag trended. But Jasmine Crockett didn't need headlines to validate her work. She had 7,000 letters that told her this wasn't about attention. It was about momentum. And momentum doesn't always roar. Sometimes it moves in silence. Sometimes it's just a woman reading a letter in her office, whispering to no one, "I hear you," and meaning every word. The silence that followed Jasmine's private session with Medicare and GAO was not the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of machinery beginning to move slowly but unmistakably. The letters hadn't stopped coming, the analysts hadn't stopped digging, and neither had the American public. 4 days after the last envelope was opened in Jasmine's office, a new sound echoed through the marble halls of the Capitol. The murmur of bipartisan agreement, a sound so rare it almost felt foreign. But this time it wasn't born of negotiation, it was born of shame. Senator Josh Hawley, once an unshakable figure behind the curtain of pharmaceutical policy, stood stripped of leverage. The Ethics Committee's internal deliberation was swift, clinical, and decisive. The vote came down at 3:14 p.m. on a Thursday. The Senate hereby suspends Senator Hawley from all roles related to healthcare policy formation for a period of 6 months effective immediately. There were no gasps, no outbursts, just a moment of uncomfortable stillness, like the eye of a hurricane that had finally made landfall. Hawley didn't stand. He didn't speak. He just folded the paper, tucked it into his folder, and stared blankly ahead. The man who once controlled the pricing narrative for life-saving drugs was now politically defanged, a silent figure in a room that no longer revolved around him. But what followed wasn't just retribution, it was redirection. A group of lawmakers, Democrat and Republican, emerged from the chaos with a proposal that had long been deemed too controversial to touch. The bill was called the National Drug Pricing Transparency Act, and its goals were as blunt as its name. For the first time in history, pharmaceutical companies would be federally required to publicly disclose their actual R&D costs behind each patented drug. Publish all lobbying contracts and financial ties to members of healthcare-related committees. File full documentation of policy influence agreements, including contributions disguised as research consulting or educational partnerships. In the past, such proposals had died in committee, suffocated by industry lobbying. But this time the wind had shifted. Jasmine didn't author the bill, but her fingerprints were all over its momentum. When she was asked to co-sponsor, she didn't hesitate. Her only comment was, "This is not punishment. This is prevention." The pressure on trioxin had become unbearable. Investors had started pulling back. Internal emails had leaked. And now Congress was sniffing around their corridors like bloodhounds. Their PR team attempted to spin a narrative of corporate responsibility, but the public wasn't buying it. Not after the hearings, not after the emails, not after Carla Watkins's medical bill was projected onto 1,000 TV screens across the country. 10 days later, in a terse press release, Trioxin announced a sweeping rollback. Clofamide would be reduced to $312 per dose, a number calculated as the break-even point based on their real manufacturing disclosures. More importantly, the company agreed to refund the price difference to over 9,000 Medicare patients who had been forced to pay full price out of pocket since the last hike. For some families, the checks were small hundreds of dollars. For others, they arrived like life rafts in the form of four-figure reimbursements. But for all of them, it was proof that something had finally cracked in the armor of the pharmaceutical machine. And then came the ripple. Institutions that had long tiptoed around drug policy suddenly found their voices. At Johns Hopkins, a three-day conference was hastily convened under the theme, "Who really controls the price of a life?" Medical historians, ethicists, and economists sat on a single stage, not debating ideology, but confronting the question that had echoed behind Jasmine's quiet war. When did price become more sacred than people? At Mayo Clinic, oncology chairs broke rank from their usual clinical neutrality and spoke openly about the psychological cost of telling patients, "Your drug exists, but your plan won't cover it." Yale, Stanford, Harvard, and dozens of public universities followed, turning lecture halls into battlefields of thought. Students began challenging outdated economic models that treated drugs as commodities instead of lifelines. Guest speakers who once dodged questions about pharma influence were now grilled on camera. The ground was shifting, and every hospital boardroom in America could feel it. A professor of public policy from the University of Michigan wrote in The Atlantic, "This is no longer a matter of political will. It is a matter of moral clarity. Transparency is not a threat to innovation. Secrecy is." Back in D.C., Jasmine kept a low profile. No parade, no media tour. She let the system do what it rarely gets the chance to do: reform itself under pressure. But her silence wasn't absence. It was vigilance. She attended briefings. She reviewed drafts. She helped rewrite sections of the bill to close loopholes she had seen exploited firsthand. One morning, she walked past a corkboard in the GAO field office near her district. Someone had printed out a quote and tacked it with a red pushpin. It read, "They didn't just raise the price of a drug, they raised the cost of hope." Representative Jasmine Crockett. She didn't remember saying it, but reading it again, she understood why it stuck. Meanwhile, Josh Hawley disappeared from the front page. No op-eds, no press junkets, no rebuttals. He declined every interview. His press secretary resigned. His calendar remained blank for weeks. Within the halls of power, he had become what every ambitious politician fears most: a ghost still sitting in his own chair. The industry itself had changed too. Other pharmaceutical giants, fearing a similar reckoning, began preemptively adjusting prices and releasing cost breakdowns voluntarily. Transparency, once a dirty word in the boardroom, was now a survival strategy. It didn't undo the damage. Nothing could bring back the lost years, the emptied savings, the funerals that happened too soon. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like the game had been interrupted, and perhaps, just maybe, the rules were about to be rewritten. And in every city and every hospital corridor, where doctors no longer whispered their frustrations and patients no longer apologized for being sick, one unspoken thought hummed beneath the surface. She did it without screaming. She did it without vengeance. She did it with truth. Under the cool glow of the Capitol's ceiling lights, the echo of recent reforms still lingered in the hallways. The tremor of accountability had reached the walls of Trierson's boardroom and the Senate floor alike. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. The real reckoning, she believed, didn't live in subpoenas or press headlines. It lived in the voices that had long been ignored, those who didn't have lobbyists or spokespeople, but who bore the price of cowardice and complicity. And now she had something radical in mind: silence from power and space for the powerless to finally speak. The chamber was the same, but the energy was different. No sharp interruptions, no political theater. This wasn't a crossfire of accusations. It was something rare in Washington listening. Jasmine had personally invited 50 individuals, patients, caregivers, nurses, and pharmacists, whose lives had been disrupted by the exact policies the Senate had once shielded behind technical jargon and economic justifications. There were no TV cameras, no networks broadcasting quotes out of context, just the hum of the air system and the soft shuffle of those walking into a room where their pain was finally policy-worthy. Jasmine stood behind the podium, hands clasped together, The sleeves of her navy blazer rolled up slightly, not to signal casualness, but readiness. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't read from a prompter. She simply said, "No one gets sick because they made a bad decision. But too many die because the people in charge of helping them didn't have the courage to say no." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every word landed like stone in still water. Today, she added, pausing to glance across the rows of worn faces and cautious eyes, "We finally said no to a price tag on human life that no soul should ever be asked to pay." The silence that followed was reverent, not empty. A retired paramedic gripped the hand of his daughter, whose insulin costs had bankrupted them 3 years earlier. A young black pharmacist nodded, wiping his eye without shame. No one was here to win. They were here to be remembered. The first to speak was a high school biology teacher from rural Indiana, her voice shaky at first but building with every sentence. She spoke of her brother diagnosed with leukemia at 31, denied a refill because the drug had shifted tiers overnight. He died waiting for financial assistance. Her testimony wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. The details, the call that came too late, the unopened syringe on the nightstand did the heavy lifting. Next came a middle-aged man in a faded VFW cap. He didn't read from a paper. He spoke from the edge of 20 years of silent anger. "I served this country," he said, voice firm, "but I couldn't serve my wife the medicine she needed when cancer came." His story didn't ask for pity. It asked for clarity. "She told me not to sell the truck. We needed it to drive our grandson to school. So I held off." She didn't make it to spring. The room didn't gasp. It absorbed. It didn't cry. It committed. Near the back, a woman with silver hair and a cane asked to speak. Jasmine stood and helped her to the center. She wore no badge, no organization pin, just a floral scarf and dignity. She looked at Jasmine, not like a politician, but like a granddaughter. "I don't know the laws. I don't understand all the policy," the elderly woman began, voice raspy but resolute. "But that day, I saw you stand up in that room. I saw you put those papers down, like they weighed more than they looked, and I realized you weren't speaking to win. You were speaking so folks like me wouldn't be forgotten." Her voice caught, but she didn't break. "You made sure someone remembered we were here." Jasmine said nothing in return. She didn't need to. Her eyes shimmered with the weight of validation, not applause, but understanding. One by one, stories poured forth. A father who'd cashed in his retirement to keep his child's chemo treatment on schedule. A nurse practitioner who confessed she'd been instructed not to mention cheaper alternatives to branded drugs, even when they were available. A young man with cystic fibrosis who said flatly, "I've had to decide whether to breathe or eat this month." Jasmine didn't speak again until the last chair had been vacated. The room had grown heavier, not with sorrow but resolve. She stepped back to the podium, fingers brushing over a handwritten note she'd carried in her jacket pocket all year. It was from a woman named Carla Watkins, whose hospital invoice, $605 for 5 doses of Clavamid, had become a symbol of quiet devastation. Carla had died weeks earlier, but Jasmine had kept her voice alive. She wrote, "I don't blame anyone. I just want to live long enough to see my son start first grade." Jasmine's voice trembled, but it didn't falter. She didn't. No one clapped. No one shouted. But in the stillness, a movement took shape, not on cable news, not in trending hashtags, but in the depth of shared grief becoming shared action. As the hearing closed, Jasmine turned to the wall behind her. There was no flag in that room, no seal. Just a framed quote from Dr. Helen Rodriguez Trias: "Health is a human right, not a privilege, not a product." Jasmine reached out and lightly touched the edge of the frame, then looked over her shoulder toward the rows of everyday people who had just done something revolutionary. They had been heard. Outside the chamber, the world hadn't changed yet, but something had cracked. Not with rage, not with spectacle, but with the slow, undeniable pressure of truth spoken clearly, repeatedly, by those who had nothing left to lose, but everything still worth fighting for. This was no longer just about drug pricing. It was about rebalancing the scales of policy and humanity. And in that silence between a grandmother's thanks and a mother's invoice, between a canceled refill and a buried spouse, a new kind of politics was taking root. One not built on winning debates, but on remembering names. Jasmine didn't walk out like a hero. She walked out like a witness. And somewhere in the gallery, someone whispered, "That's how justice begins." As the applause faded and the chamber emptied, something deeper settled over those who had watched Jasmine Crockett stand not just justice, but clarity. From the capital to rural clinics, from university halls to kitchen tables, where families rationed medication, one truth began to crystallize. This was never only about drug prices. It was about human value, who gets to assign it and who dares to defend it when the numbers say otherwise. Jasmine hadn't just exposed a corrupt pricing scheme or brought a senator to his knees. She had reminded a nation of its conscience, and that reminder was loud even in silence. What made her message hit so hard wasn't the paperwork, the statistics, or even the courtroom wins. It was the simple fact that she listened. She brought the words of the voiceless into rooms they had never been allowed to enter. The mother who couldn't afford 5 doses, the doctor forced to watch patients choose between chemo and rent, the senior who mailed a handwritten letter because they didn't know how to email. Jasmine didn't speak over them. She carried their truth like a shield into battle and made sure those truths echoed where power had grown too deaf to hear. People don't get sick because they fail, she said, but they die because power failed them. That sentence alone stripped away decades of political excuses. In one sentence, she collapsed the distance between legislation and the real world, between a senator's pen and a child's funeral, between policy and pain. It reminded every person watching, especially the ones who had started to believe no one was fighting for them, that morality doesn't have to come with a price tag. And that's the heart of the message we need to carry into our own lives. It's not just Jasmine's job. It's not just Congress's problem. We live in systems built on silent calculations of what a life is worth, of who deserves care, of how long someone must wait to be seen. Those systems thrive not just because of bad people, but because too many good people think it's someone else's fight. But Jasmine didn't wait for permission to speak. She didn't check if it was safe. She didn't wait for a hashtag or a poll. She acted, because that's what leadership actually is: not speeches, not status, but courage in the absence of certainty. So what do we do with that courage? We use it. Not all of us can walk into a Senate hearing, but all of us can speak up in a town hall. All of us can check who funds our representatives. All of us can ask our doctors why our pills cost more this month than last. All of us can stop saying that's just the way it is and start asking who made it that way. Because the moment we stop treating injustice as normal is the moment we start weakening its grip. Jasmine didn't win by shouting louder. She won by making truth too heavy to ignore. And when that truth finally landed on desks, in inboxes, in late-night news cycles, it didn't sound like politics. It sounded like decency. A woman saying, "I just wanted to live to see my son go to first grade." That line didn't need a law degree to understand. It didn't need charts or committees. It needed only a beating heart and the willingness to feel. It reminded us that behind every statistic, there's a name. Behind every policy, there's a face. And behind every dollar saved by the system, there might be a grave. What Jasmine proved is that change doesn't always begin with a revolution. It begins with a refusal. A refusal to pretend it's okay. A refusal to look away. A refusal to let silence count as neutrality. Because silence in rooms of power is complicity. So the next time someone tells you healthcare is complicated, ask them who benefits from keeping it that way. The next time someone says there's no money to help patients, ask where the millions went last quarter. The next time someone says there's nothing we can do, remember Jasmine holding up that hospital bill, staring down a senator and saying price doesn't kill, but your policy is doing it for it. And then ask yourself, what room am I in? What truth needs to be said there? Maybe it's a workplace that cuts corners. Maybe it's a local board that ignores elders. Maybe it's a friend group that jokes at someone else's expense. Wherever it is, remember this: the rooms don't change until someone stays standing. Jasmine Crockett stood. So can you. And when you do, when you ask the hard question, when you challenge the easy lie, when you carry someone's truth into a room where it doesn't yet belong, know this: you are continuing her work. You are pushing that moral arc a little closer to justice, not because you're a politician, but because you're a person who gives a damn. And that, in the end, is how systems break. Not with a bang, but with a voice that refuses to forget, a voice that refuses to sell out silence for comfort, a voice that says, like Jasmine said, not for applause, not for revenge, but because it was right. Today we said no to putting a price tag on human life. That sentence didn't just close a hearing, it opened a movement. And you're already part of it. But movements are not born in marble halls alone. They grow in kitchens where bills stack higher than groceries, in hospital rooms where families trade hope for debt, in the quiet moments when someone whispers, "We can't afford to fight." Jasmine's words lit the match, but it is the people who keep the fire alive. Every signature on a petition, every call to a senator, every refusal to accept despair, that is the echo of her stand. History doesn't change when leaders speak. It changes when ordinary people decide the silence has gone on long enough. So the question is not whether Jasmine Crockett spoke loudly enough that day. The question is whether we will carry that voice into every corner of this nation until justice can no longer be denied. The hearing ended, but the reckoning has only just begun. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.